So welcome to this one in the series of the Word Made Flesh, with Chester Cathedral and Chester Diocese working together in partnership. Today we have Professor George Brooke, but before Liz introduces him, a reminder of those words from John's Gospel. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten, of the Father, full of grace and truth. So Liz, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome, George, to speak to us today. I'm sure you're exactly the right person to do this topic of Is John Antisemitic, with all your knowledge of Qumran and early Christianity and so on. If you want to know loads about George, you can look at on a whole list of publications and things, but I'll tell you a little story instead. I did a placement with Jane when I was thinking about becoming ordained, and I did a preach the first time. And I was terrified because George was in the congregation, and George was very gracious and encouraging. So thanks for that, George. And we look forward to hear what you're going to say to us today.
Thank you very much, Liz. Let me share my screen. So hopefully everybody can see that satisfactorily. In fact, when Jane and Liz were putting this series together, I suggested that maybe we should address this topic in some way. And then when it came to the allocation of speakers to topics, I drew the short straw and ended up with this topic, which is a tricky one. Is John anti-Semitic? Let's see how we go, and then open the floor to some questions. Let's have a quick think about race and ethnicity, which of course are particular terms carrying a lot of baggage in a variety of different ways and different contexts in the modern world for us, and we can get very easily tripped up by the misuse of terms. Perhaps we can say that the precise term for race, genos, does not occur in the Gospel of John, so that the implication is that whereas some New Testament writers are concerned with this topic, not least Paul, John does not seem to have a particular attitude to race as such. But there is mention of Nathanael as truly an Israelite. And other mentions of Israel in the Gospel, they seem to indicate that the debate in the Gospel is really about the revelation to Israel that comes in the incarnation, which is identified. That is, the word is identified as Jesus Christ, what it is to be a true Israelite, and Jesus as a teacher of Israel. Of course, it's not easy to argue that Israel is solely a racial or ethnic term. It can also refer to a place, and that's how it's used to some extent in the Hebrew Bible. But certainly Israel is a positive term in the Gospel. The precise term for people or nation, ethnos, occurs in a few places in the Gospel, particularly in John 11:48 to 52, where Caiaphas speaks of what is best for the people, that one man should die. So he's clearly speaking on behalf of how the many modern translations translate ethnos on behalf of the people. And some modern translations actually use the word nation in that context. Intriguingly, of course, the term nation itself is problematic, largely emerging in our modern usage out of the 19th century movements towards nationalism, the aftermath of which we still live with very much in our current international and political crises. So in addition to Caiaphas using it, in John 18:35, Pilate comments that he is not a Judaios, and we can debate how that should be translated, whether as Judean or Jewish or a Jew, but that Jesus' own nation and the chief priests have handed Jesus over to him. So John puts the word ethnos in Pilate's mouth as he, in effect, lives out what Caiaphas has spoken as of significance in John 11. So we do have a little bit about ethnicity in the sense of the reference to the people who we might identify as Jews. The Gospel of John, as I've indicated, is not overly concerned with racial issues, particularly as we conceptualize them today. At the time that the Gospel was written in Greco-Roman antiquity, one's identity was created through a multiplicity of different matters. But commonly, one's ethnic identity was not determined so much by country, which is how we often understand nation, but by the city region from which one came. So an ethnos would be those people associated with Athens or Sparta or Rome. You are a Roman citizen. And we should notice that it's, you are a Roman citizen, not a citizen of Italia or some Roman province, but a city, namely Rome. And so it is that we could construct a case for which Jerusalem is the ethnic marker for Jews. That's the city which has the hinterland, the region in which Jews live. Though Jews clearly live elsewhere as well, though perhaps even those who live elsewhere all have an attitude towards Jerusalem, either positive or negative, not least in as much as they may have been paying the temple tax to the temple in Jerusalem. Now, there is indeed plenty about Jerusalem in the Gospel of John, not least because Jesus visits 3 times during his ministry and is portrayed as challenging and redefining Jewish institutions, especially the temple and the festivals associated with temple worship. So one could suggest that whenever there is discussion of Jerusalem, John is engaging with ethnic matters. But it's, of course, not just, I seem to be on the wrong button here. Let's see if I can do this. Here we go. It's not just with Jerusalem that the gospel is concerned. What's of interest in particular, and this is what partly creates the conundrum of the gospel, is that the term Judaios, which underpins the translation Jew, occurs but 5 times in Matthew and Luke, 6 times in Mark, but 70 times in the Gospel of John. So it's a favorite term for the author of the Gospel. It's a term that he's happy with. It's a term that he wants to use in how he portrays Jesus during his ministry and in the Passion account. It's a term which, if you like, carries rhetorical significance for the author of the Gospel. It's prominent. Whereas the synoptic Gospels tend to specify who was arguing with Jesus. In other words, they don't say it's just the Jews. They talk rather of Pharisees. John tends to use the term Jews somewhat indiscriminately. John's Gospel frequently uses the term in contexts of hostility. It's the Jews who want to kill Jesus. It's the Jews who want to stone Jesus. Though there are passages where he used the term Jew or Jews in a neutral way, such as when he describes the festivals of the Jews or their customs or Jewish leaders. He even uses it in a positive way. One example, perhaps the most obvious here, you can see on the screen, is John 4:22, where he talks about salvation coming from the Jews, putting the words in Jesus's mouth as Jesus addresses the woman of Samaria at the well. So it's not all a negative term by any means, but predominantly the term Jew is used in a hostile way in the Gospel of those who have it in for Jesus. Now, of course, we have anti-Semitism and related issues very much in the news currently and just recently. For example, Bert Colucci, the US neo-Nazi leader, has been speaking explicitly anti-Semitically, and some of his group of neo-Nazis have been very vociferous, particularly in Florida, in the midterm election campaigning that's going on at the moment. Though the photograph on your screen comes from a period about a year ago when he was making fairly explicit anti-Jewish statements. You can see that image itself is copyright stop anti-Semites. So it's an image that is produced by those who are trying to limit the damage that such anti-Jewish rhetoric comes to produce. One intriguing feature of Colucci's anti-Jewish rhetoric in the United States is that he commonly speaks of the Jews as of the devil, which in fact is precisely what we find in John chapter 8. Although this is a very different area, the picture in the middle of Shaima Dalali, she has just been dismissed as president of the National Union of Students, accused of anti-Semitism in her background. Apparently, she, when she was 18, tweeted some anti-Jewish comments. Although those were long ago deleted, she now finds herself challenged by people who wish to make sure there is no anti-Jewishness within the Union. And the obverse of anti-Semitism in our own context might even be suggested by what's taking place in Israel at this very moment, where Benjamin Netanyahu is likely to become the next Prime Minister of Israel, supported by the Israeli far-right religious Zionist movement, which is led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has some very forthright things to say about the place of the Palestinians and what should be done with them. So that this kind of rhetorical stance can indeed work both ways and be extremely problematic. What I'm suggesting is that to get a handle on anti-Semitism in John's Gospel, we need to be aware of our own current context and what it is that we need to take into account. There are two definitions of anti-Semitism which are widely used currently. The first, from the Jewish Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, is that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred of Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. The Jewish Holocaust Remembrance Alliance then gives multiple examples of what they consider to be possible instances of anti-Semitism. And a large number of Jews have found some of their examples problematic, particularly when it comes to discussion of the politics of the State of Israel. It's almost as if the JHRA definition is protective of the State of Israel in such a way that it becomes impossible to enter into any kind of critique of what's taking place in Israel or in the occupied West Bank. So a large number of folk prefer to use the Jerusalem definition of anti-Semitism, which is a bit vaguer, but it's more general and reads as anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish. And that allows then for comment about the State of Israel, because one would not be commenting on the State of Israel because it is a Jewish state, but because of its political stance on any particular item. It's only if you were to attack the State of Israel because of what you identified as its Jewishness that you would end up being defined as making an anti-Semitic statement as such. Intriguingly, it's the JHRA statement which has been imposed by the government on universities in the UK as the one that they should operate on campuses in trying to identify where there may be anti-Semitism. So Jewish academics on UK campuses are often worried about this, seeking rather to impose or argue for the place of the Jerusalem definition. Now, when we look at the fourth gospel, at John's gospel, it seems to many folk that we have four kinds of anti-Jewishness in the gospel. And each of these has contributed to the fourth gospel being a major source of anti-Semitic behavior, particularly amongst Christian groups, through the centuries. And we just need to have a quick look at the four kinds. The first is what is commonly designated as the supersessionist kind of anti-Jewishness. The reading of the Gospel of John as saying that its view of Jesus Christ and the narrative about him is superior to everything that preceded it, especially in the Old Testament. Supersessionism also is a reading that not only asserts superiority, but also insists that Jesus Christ and belief in him replaces any form of religion that was prior to or contemporary with Jesus. And a key example of supersessionism is found in the debates and discussion about John 1:16 to 17. From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, Catherine Williams, when she was talking to us in our first session, commented on this text and said that grace upon grace was a mistranslation in her understanding, and that this is the New Revised Standard Version attempting to soften what the text could best be read as saying, namely that there is grace against grace, grace instead of grace. In other words, that the grace and truth that comes through Jesus Christ replaces the grace that comes through the law given through Moses. The editors of the translation in the New Revised Standard Version are taking a slightly different view and offering a possible translation of the Greek, which qualifies the kind of supersessionist reading that might be preferred by some. And in so doing, you can see that the semicolon after Moses becomes very important. That is, the law indeed was given through Moses, and all of that is divine revelation and all very good. Grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. Grace and truth, of course, being a pair of words found in the description of God in Exodus chapter 34, which is part of the narrative, the second time that Moses goes up the mountain. So that all that the text might be saying is that the grace and truth of Exodus 34 is now made explicit in Jesus Christ. So there is no supersession necessarily here, no replacement, but simply something built upon something else to make the divine purposes clear. The King James Version, so we're back in 1611, reads, "And of his fullness have all we received, and grace for grace," going with the kind of translation that might suggest replacement. "For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ." Now, in the King James Version, when italics are used, as in the word but, in that instance, when italics are used, what we understand is that there is no Greek word being translated. That is the way in which the translators are making sense of the Greek. However, unbeknownst to the translators, of the King James Version, we now know that some ancient manuscripts, such as Papyrus 66, one of the earliest copies of parts of John's Gospel, did include such a particle, namely de, implying that the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. So it's not that one builds on the other, rather one replaces the other. So to my mind, this is very intriguing because it implies that some traditors, some people who were transmitting the text of the fourth gospel, they're in a minority, but some transmitters wanted, felt the need for this but in the sentence in John 1:17, so that there was a supersessionist reading of the text. So this is something that has to be sorted out. Do we go with the way in which the NRSV wants to portray the text, that the revelation that comes through Jesus Christ is simply building upon that given through Moses, making explicit what the law was all about, etc.? Or do we go with Papyrus 66 and the implication of grace for grace, that one replaces the other, that Jesus replaces the law given by Moses? Supersessionism is a dangerous doctrine, and most Christian churches have sought in complicated theological ways to move beyond it. The second kind of anti-Jewishness in the gospel comes in a passage, for example, like John 9:22. That is, that the fourth gospel is anti-synagogue. The gospel, of course, is written at the end of the first century, maybe even into the beginning of the second century. But by the end of the first century, it seems as if a split has occurred between the followers of Jesus and the synagogue, and that gets reflected in the narrative. John 9:22 says his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. Here very explicitly that term, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. The gospel probably composed at the end of the first century, at a time when the parting of the ways between Jews and early Christians was becoming increasingly noticeable. Jews and Jesus followers were going their own separate ways, not least because Jesus followers were becoming predominantly Gentile, non-Jewish. Now, most scholars try to temper the way in which John 9 is expressed to argue that this kind of anti-Jewishness is about Jewish exclusion of Jesus followers, rather than that it's about Jesus followers attacking synagogues, and that it's, if you like, the Jews who are taking the initiative to say, no, I'm afraid we can't have Jesus followers any longer in the synagogue. However you read the text, it's certainly the case that there is some antagonism or hostility between the synagogue and those who confess Jesus to be the Christ, the Messiah. A third kind of anti-Jewishness in the gospel is to return to what we were saying earlier about ethnicity, and argue that in several places, the label Jew refers to those who lived in Judea, in Judah, and is not a label for all Jews throughout the world at the time. For example, in John 7:1, Jesus went about in Galilee. He didn't want to go about in Judea because the Jews were looking for an opportunity to kill him. So the Jews in that passage seem to be identifiable with those who lived in Judea. These are the ones in the hinterland of Jerusalem. Or in chapter 11, when Jesus wishes to go to Judea again, the disciples object that the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again? So these Jews seem to be Judeans. And some scholars would wish to actually translate the term Judaios, Judaioi here as Judeans. John 4:44 at the end of chapter 4 implies that Jesus was not welcome in Judea, but rather in Galilee. When the 2 days were over, he went from that place to Galilee, for Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in the prophet's own country. When he came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, since they had seen all that had been done in Jerusalem at the festival. So the text in John seems to imply that it's those in Jerusalem who had not welcomed Jesus. That's Jesus' own country. But it's those in Galilee. More specifically, in a text like John chapter 1, verse 19, this is the testimony given by John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" We seem to have the use of the term Jew there as more specifically applying to the religious authorities in Jerusalem. They're the ones who are sending the priests and the Levites to ask who Jesus is. So the term Jew in some texts may mean Judean rather than simply being Jewish in some ethnic or familial manner. And then there is the fourth kind of anti-Jewishness, which is that the label Jew is used of those from early on in the gospel, such as John 5:18, used of those who seek to kill Jesus. It's the Jews who seek to kill Jesus, not some of the Pharisees or some of the priests, but the Jews. Jews also are put into John's dualistic way of thinking, his rhetorical presentation in the gospel, when John is distinguishing between who is above and who is below, who is in the light and who is in the dark, who's for truth, who's for falsehood. The Jews are amongst those who are below. They're in the dark. They are the false ones. So it becomes very much a black and white affair. And in many instances, John uses the label Jew in this hostile and negative way. So Jews are aligned in chapter 8 in a particularly vicious manner, which we have to temper somehow with their father, the devil. In 8:48, it's clear that the Jews answered him in relation to who is your father. They say it's Abraham. Jesus says to them, if Abraham were your father, or if God were your father, then you would know who to follow. But you are from your father, says Jesus, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and doesn't stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. So we've got this truth falsehood thing, and the Jews being identified as belonging to the devil, as murderers. So this is a very difficult passage for us to stomach, because it can be so easily mistaken as currently by neo-Nazis in the United States, for example. So we have 4 problematic issues to do with Jews and Judaism in the 4th Gospel. Is John anti-Semitic? Well, it all depends. The author of the Gospel was most likely a Jew himself, but probably, as is reflected in chapter 9, of a post-synagogue kind. In other words, he's either been thrown out of the synagogue or taken himself off in order to engage with his community, because the Gospel is written principally for non-Jews. Nevertheless, Jesus himself is clearly a Jew. In the prologue, he's the one who comes to his own people. But of course, some of them do not receive him. And it's those who are labeled as Jews throughout the Gospel, the ones who don't receive Jesus. Because the Gospel is written principally for non-Jews, and so takes a rhetorical position from its own perspective of the life, ministry, and death of Jesus, that is a non-Jewish, an outsider view, much of that will have influenced the way in which stereotypical language used in a dualistic framework comes to mean that Jews are portrayed with hostility in a very negative fashion as belonging to the devil. That rhetorical position, read superficially, has resulted in very much harm over the centuries, as we all should be aware. Now, anti-Semitism, of course, predates Christianity. Jews in the ancient world were persecuted by others before there were any Christians to enter into debate with them. But it's certainly the case that once Christianity became the dominant religion in the Mediterranean world and beyond, particularly from the time of Constantine onwards, the 4th Gospel was used as a text in order to create a hostile environment for Jews, and often much a negative persecution of them. Thank you very much for your attention. And we've got a few minutes for some questions.
Thank you, George. Anyone for any questions or any thoughts or comments? Liz looks as though she's got one, but she's not going to say it.
Yeah,
Have you got one, Liz?
I'm trying to formulate one. Is it for religious, some prophecy buried in the Old Testament or something in the Hebrew Bible? Why did the Jews cop for it all the way through history?
That's a very large question. I think if we just focus on the 4th Gospel, we've got the author of the Gospel using this label to tar the opposition with. So in the ancient world, apart from the 4th Gospel, well, apart from the New Testament, even before there were Christians, Jews were often persecuted because of their different customs, and because they argued convincingly, many instances, for special privileges, so that they didn't have to work on Shabbat. And we even have in Josephus lists of cities in the Roman Empire which were encouraged, indeed maybe even enforced, to provide kosher food, to make that available in the marketplace for Jews to purchase. But they were well known in some contexts for having peculiar customs and certain privileges, and this led to people having a hostile attitude towards them, with all kinds of taunts, such as Jews don't wash.
Yeah.
That is because they keep Shabbat, so they tend not to do certain things which other people might do on that day. So all of that added into the way in which some New Testament texts can be read have given the opportunity for Christians in some places at some times to be amongst the leaders of those persecuting Jews in their context. And of course, even in England, in this country, we have our own history of Jewish persecution, as we all know. Anybody who's visited York is challenged by this problem.
So John is almost the best and the worst of the Gospels in this particular instance, isn't it? Because on the one hand, he's theologically good, and you got, you know, all the patterns and the I am sayings and the miracles and all that. And then on the other hand, it's got this very deep flaw in it, which seems like whoever wrote it, whether it was a community or a person or whatever, it's just like the church nowadays, really. Quite good and deeply flawed.
Yes, although I think we have to do our best to try to get into John's rhetorical strategy, is what I'm trying to suggest today. And that it's just, once you are aware of what's going on in the gospel, you can say, well, okay, you've used this stereotypical language. Shouldn't you have followed the synoptics and been a little bit more precise as to who you mean in each instance?
Yeah.
But that's actually not the case. But you have to dig beneath the surface of the text to have some sensible explanation. And that's what recent statements, particularly since the Holocaust, recent statements by all the churches have tried to do, is to qualify the way in which the fourth gospel is used in the church.
Yeah, sure.
Particularly on Good Friday, of course, for Roman Catholics.
Yes.
John.
Thank you very much, George. It's extremely interesting. I don't know whether there's been a lot of work on this, and obviously it's showing my ignorance if there has, and I don't know. But clearly the writer or writers of John's Gospel are looking back at what happened during the time of Jesus and recording that for posterity. But as you say, it was probably towards the end of the first century. And the Jews were quite good at having uprisings repeatedly against the Romans. And they were doing that a bit throughout the diaspora, but it might have been slightly later. And some well-established, well-assimilated Jews were losing all their businesses and suffering a lot from some keen Zionistic Jews rising up against the Romans. So do you think some of that going on might have irritated the writer or writers of John's Gospel and made them a little bit more anti their fellow Jews?
That's a very intricate and nicely put point, John. I think that could well be the case, that in some sense, the fourth gospel is being written after the Jewish War of 66 to 70 or 74, those 8 years when the Jews tried to tackle Rome very unsuccessfully in the end. And we know of subsequent riots involving Jews, particularly the riots that spread through a number of different cities in AD 117. There were anti-Roman riots in several places. And then, of course, they took on the Romans again in 132 to 135 at the Emperor Hadrian. His two big problems were what was happening at Hadrian's Wall in this country, what was happening in Judea with Jews of a particular sort. So yes, it could well be that the author of the fourth gospel has a certain frustration with his fellow Jews because of that. Though, again, one would think that it actually only concerns some Jews. Why doesn't he specify who they are rather than using their label as a whole? Two books which I've used particularly in this presentation is John Gage's The Origins of Anti-Semitism and Terence Donaldson, Jews and Anti-Judaism in the New Testament. These are very useful summaries of where scholarship has got to on this topic.
Thank you very much indeed. I think our time is up. Thank you very much, George, for that. And thank you for the questions as well. Next week, we have Michael Gilbertson, the Archdeacon of Chester, on Where Are There Signs Today? So we'll look forward to hearing from him then next week. Meanwhile, have a good week. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.